The biting cold of Detroit's early morning wind nipped at Amanda's fingers as she pulled her thin coat tighter around her frame. Her eyes darted to the horizon, scanning the bleak landscape of run-down brick buildings and crumbling sidewalks. It had been months since Michael's accident, and each day seemed colder, harder to bear. She tightened her grip on the torn grocery bag, which barely held enough food to get them through another day. Ethan and Lily were still asleep when she left the apartment, their small breaths filling the cramped room with warmth that felt worlds apart from the harshness of the outside. The rent was overdue again, and Ethan had started asking questions. "When are we moving to a better house, Mum?" Amanda had no answers. The weight of her husband's debts pressed down on her shoulders like an anchor, dragging her deeper into a life she barely recognized anymore. As she made her way through the back alleys, Amanda's eyes instinctively scanned the trash bins. It wasn't the first time she'd done this. Ever since Michael's gambling had left them penniless, she had grown used to finding meals where most people wouldn't dare look. But pride had no place in survival, especially when her children's hunger was a daily reminder of their harsh reality. Her fingers, numb from the cold, sifted through a half-empty bin behind a corner store. Plastic bags, broken glass, and stale food filled it. But Amanda kept going. A faint hope clung to her that maybe today there'd be something. A discarded loaf of bread, maybe a can that hadn't been opened. It was in moments like these that the quiet of the early morning was deafening. The streets were empty, save for the occasional car rumbling in the distance, and the silence allowed her thoughts to surface. Thoughts of failure, of doubt, and the gnawing feeling that she wasn't enough. Then her hand brushed against something unusual. Not the cold metal of a can or the crumpled texture of plastic. This was different. It felt soft, worn with age. She pulled it out, blinking against the dim light. A wallet. Amanda stood frozen for a moment, staring at the worn leather in her hands. Her heart beat a little faster. She hadn't seen a wallet like this in years. Real leather, thick stitching. Someone had clearly thrown it away, but why? It could have been empty, a worthless relic tossed in the garbage. But it could also mean something more. Money, hope, trouble. Her first instinct was to shove it back into the trash and walk away, pretend she hadn't seen it. This kind of luck, if it was luck, never ended well. And yet, her fingers tightened around it. She couldn't let go. The image of Ethan's questioning eyes, of Lily's small hands reaching for more food that wasn't there, flashed through her mind. Amanda opened the wallet slowly, her breath visible in the cold air as she exhaled. Inside were more money than she had seen in her life. But it wasn't the money that made her heart stop. She stuffed the wallet into her coat pocket, suddenly aware of the stillness around her. She looked up, half expecting someone to appear from the shadows to claim the wallet or accuse her of theft. But the alley was empty. Amanda sat at the small, worn-out kitchen table, the wallet heavy in her hands. The dim light from the lone bulb flickered, casting shadows on the walls of the cramped apartment. Ethan and Lily still slept, their soft breathing the only sound breaking the tense silence. She hadn't even dared take off her coat since returning home, her body stiff with unease. Slowly, her fingers ran along the edges of the wallet. It was old, but not cheap. Whoever had tossed it away hadn't done so by accident. She could feel it in her gut. With a final glance toward the bedroom door, Amanda opened it. The bills were the first thing that caught her eye. $5, maybe $600. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more than enough to cover groceries for the next month, pay down a fraction of the rent, maybe even get the lights back on. The temptation was immediate. A voice inside whispered, "No one would know. Just take the money." But beneath the bills, something else glinted, slim, glossy photos. Her breath hitched as she slid them out. faces, faces of children, boys and girls, smiling in some photos, blank and unsmiling in others. Their names and ages were written in neat handwriting on the backs. Dylan, age 8. Sarah, age 6. Amanda's stomach churned. She sifted through the images, her fingers trembling. There were more than just photos, folded papers, some official-looking with dates and addresses, others typed out lists of names. Her mind raced. She didn't want to understand what this was. She didn't want to acknowledge the gnawing fear creeping into her chest. But the reality of it was undeniable. Missing children. Amanda stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor as she did. The cash, the photos, the documents. It was too much. She paced the small kitchen, trying to make sense of it all, her thoughts tangling together. This wasn't some random wallet lost by a passerby. This was a door to something much darker, something she wasn't ready to open. She stopped by the window, parting the curtains slightly to peer outside. The alleyway she had walked through earlier was still, but now the darkness seemed heavier, like it was watching her, pressing in. Her pulse quickened. Had she been followed? Was someone out there now, waiting for her to make a move? She quickly pulled the curtains shut. Her heart raced as she leaned against the wall, clutching the wallet close to her chest. She had to think, had to be smart about this. The cash. God, they needed it so badly. The rent was already overdue, and the landlord had warned her he wouldn't wait any longer. Ethan had been asking why they couldn't buy new shoes or have something other than canned soup for dinner. This money could fix so much, even if just for a little while. But the photos, the names. Amanda squeezed her eyes shut, pushing back tears of frustration. There was no way she could take that money without the knowledge of what it came with. She felt like the walls were closing in, her options shrinking. She thought of Michael and the debt he'd left her with. His gambling addiction had destroyed any safety net they once had. He had lied, stolen, promised it would get better, just like this money promised now. Amanda knew better than to trust it. She opened her eyes and forced herself to look down at the wallet again. Her hands were shaking. She slid the cash back inside and closed it. The cold reality was that keeping the money wouldn't just be a lie to herself, it could be a door into something far more dangerous than poverty. A shiver ran down her spine, and suddenly she felt eyes on her. She snapped her head toward the window, heart pounding. The alley was still empty, but the feeling remained. She wasn't safe, not with what she now held. Amanda took a deep breath. She needed to decide, now. Either she walked away and pretended this never happened, or she faced the storm that was clearly coming. With trembling fingers, she shoved the wallet deep into her coat pocket, as though hiding it could delay the inevitable. But she knew in her gut that whatever this was, whatever danger she had stumbled into, it was already too late to turn back. Amanda sat by the window, her eyes glued to the street outside. The light was fading, casting long shadows on the empty sidewalk. Ethan was late. Again. She tapped her fingers against the chipped frame of the window, trying to shake off the creeping unease in her chest. It was probably nothing. Kids get distracted, lose track of time. But this wasn't the first time. She stood up and glanced at the clock on the wall. Already an hour passed when Ethan was supposed to be home. She grabbed her coat, pulled it over her shoulders, and stepped outside, hoping she'd see him around the corner, walking home with his backpack slung over one shoulder, his usual smile breaking across his face when he saw her. But the street was empty. Amanda's pace quickened as she moved down the block, scanning every face she passed. She reached the corner and spotted Mrs. Thompson watering her dying front yard. Amanda waved. hoping the woman had seen something. "Ethan hasn't come home from school yet," Amanda said, trying to keep her voice steady. Mrs. Thompson barely looked up from her garden hose. "I'm sure he'll turn up, dear," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Kids these days, they're always off somewhere, aren't they?" Amanda forced a smile, her stomach knotting. She thanked Mrs. Thompson and continued down the street. But as she walked, her steps grew heavier, her breathing more shallow. Panic began to seep in, slow at first, then faster, clawing its way into her mind. She stopped at the playground, her eyes darting to the swings. Empty. The benches, empty. She called out his name, her voice shaky. "Ethan! Ethan!" The only answer was the wind rustling through the trees. Her heart raced as she checked behind the slides, beneath the monkey bars. Nothing. Her mind went back to the wallet. Those photos. The children. Her pulse quickened. She clenched her fists, fighting the urge to panic completely. "It can't be connected," she told herself. "He's probably just playing with his friends somewhere." But even as she tried to reason with herself, the fear was growing. The memory of those glossy pictures, those kids' faces, their names, wouldn't leave her. Amanda turned back toward the street, breaking into a jog now, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The neighborhood felt colder, the buildings more oppressive, as if they were closing in around her. She tried not to think the worst, but it was too late. Her mind was racing, replaying every scenario, every possibility. She rushed to the corner store where Ethan sometimes stopped on his way home, bursting through the door and startling the clerk behind the counter. "Did Ethan come by?" she asked, her voice sharp, almost pleading. "My son Ethan. He's 7, brown hair, red jacket." The clerk shook his head, frowning. "Haven't seen him today. Sorry, ma'am." Amanda's stomach dropped. She stumbled back out onto the sidewalk, her hand gripping the edge of the doorframe for support. The streetlights flickered on, casting a dim glow over the neighborhood. Each flicker seemed to bring her closer to breaking. She looked around frantically, unsure of where to go next. Her breathing grew erratic, her mind scattered. She turned down another street, hoping, no, praying that Ethan would appear, running toward her, telling her it was all just a misunderstanding. But he didn't. She was moving faster now, almost sprinting as she knocked on doors, asking anyone and everyone if they had seen her son. Some hadn't. Some barely bothered to answer at all. The walls of fear were closing in. She felt the weight of helplessness pressing down on her, and with each unanswered knock, her hope diminished. By the time she reached the park at the edge of the neighborhood, the dread had settled deep into her bones. Ethan wasn't here. He wasn't anywhere. She stood in the middle of the empty park, her breath shaky, her body trembling. And then, as if in slow motion, the thought hit her. The wallet. The pictures, the missing children. She didn't want to believe it, but the connection was undeniable. Her legs felt weak as she leaned against a bench, her mind spiraling. Is this why Ethan was taken? The thought alone made her sick. Amanda paced outside the apartment, her nerves fraying with every step. The cold Detroit air bit at her skin, but the fear pulsing through her veins burned hotter. Ethan had been missing for hours, and every minute felt like an eternity. She glanced down the street for the 100th time, hoping against hope that he'd suddenly appear, smiling, acting as if nothing had happened. Instead, she spotted someone else, a man, moving towards her from the end of the block. Tall, broad-shouldered, and covered in a worn leather jacket that seemed too tight for his build. Her heart sank when she noticed the tattoo on his neck. She recognized him instantly. Frank. Her pulse quickened. Frank had been one of Michael's old contacts, a regular at the grimy bars and underground poker games where Michael had spent so much of their money. He'd never been friendly. His eyes always had a coldness, as if he took pleasure in seeing others squirm under the weight of their debts. And now, with his slow, deliberate approach, Amanda knew something was wrong. He stopped a few feet away, lighting a cigarette, the small flicker of the lighter casting a shadow across his face. "Heard about your boy," he said, his voice low, gravelly. The words were casual, but his smile, thin and crooked, made her stomach churn. Amanda froze. She felt the breath leave her lungs. "What do you mean?" "Do you know where he is?" Her voice was barely steady. Frank took a long drag on the cigarette, eyes narrowing as he exhaled. "Depends. Might have heard some things, might know some people who could help. But you know how this goes." He flicked ash onto the ground. "Nothing's free, sweetheart." Her hands clenched into fists. "What do you want?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He wasn't here to help, not without a price. He took a step closer, towering over her. "Let's just say Michael still owes, and since he's not around to pay, well..." His eyes flickered up and down, appraising her like she was another commodity. "Looks like you'll have to settle that debt. But it doesn't have to be money. I'm a reasonable guy. You do a little something for me and I make some calls, find out where they've got your kid." Amanda's stomach tightened. The world seemed to tilt as her fear mixed with rage. She could feel her body tremble, but not from the cold. The web of Michael's debts had entangled her, and now it had pulled Ethan into its grasp. This was more than a mistake, more than a missing boy. This was deliberate. "I don't have anything," Amanda said through clenched teeth. Her voice, though shaking, held an edge of defiance. Frank chuckled, the sound low and sinister. "That's not true. You've got more than you think." He leaned in, his breath warm against her cheek. "But you're running out of time, sweetheart. Either you pay up or someone else gets your boy. And trust me, the people who've got him now, they're not as friendly as I am." Amanda's heart pounded in her chest, every instinct screaming at her to back away, to run. But something kept her grounded. Fear for Ethan, yes, but something stronger too. She wasn't about to let this man, or anyone else, hold her child over her like some kind of bargaining chip. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I'll find him on my own," she said, her voice firmer than before. "I don't need your help." Frank's eyes narrowed, the smirk on his face fading. "You're making a mistake, Amanda. Don't think for a second that you can handle this on your own. You don't know these people." His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "They'll break you before you even get close." Amanda didn't flinch. She stood her ground, refusing to show the fear gnawing at her insides. "Stay away from my family," she said, her words like steel, "or you'll regret it." Frank watched her for a moment longer, his eyes searching her face. Then, with a final puff of smoke, he tossed the cigarette to the ground and crushed it beneath his boot. "Have it your way," he muttered, turning on his heel and walking back into the shadows. Amanda stood there, watching him disappear, her heart still racing. She knew what Frank said was true. She wasn't ready for the danger ahead, but that didn't matter. Ethan was out there, and no one, not Frank, not anyone, was going to stop her from getting him back. Amanda stared at the photographs again, her fingers tracing the edges as if they could offer her answers. Each face stared back at her, innocent, missing. She felt her stomach twist. These weren't just forgotten children on some flyer or nameless faces from the news. These were real lives, and now Ethan was tangled in this nightmare. The day felt colder than usual as she walked through Detroit's streets. The noise of the city buzzed around her, but it all blurred into the background. She was heading toward the community shelter, one of the first places she could think of where people might know something about the kids in the photos. Amanda hoped that maybe, just maybe, someone would recognize a face, offer a clue, anything that could get her closer to Ethan. Inside the shelter, the stale scent of old coffee mixed with the faint odor of sweat. A few people milled about, some regulars, others new. She approached the front desk, where a tired-looking woman glanced up from behind a stack of papers. "I'm looking for someone," Amanda began, pulling out the photographs she'd found in the wallet. "I was hoping you might recognize one of these kids." The woman eyed her cautiously. "We get a lot of people through here, but I'm not sure I can help." She hesitated before taking the photos, flipping through them with a faint frown. These kids looked like they'd been missing a while. Amanda swallowed. "Yeah, I think they've been taken. Do you know anything about trafficking rings? People who deal in—" "Look, lady," the woman interrupted, her voice lowered. "That's dangerous talk. You ask too many questions about that, you'll end up in trouble yourself." Amanda felt her pulse quicken. "I don't have a choice. My son, he's missing." The woman's eyes softened slightly, but she shook her head. "If I were you, I'd be careful. There are people around here who don't take kindly to strangers poking into their business." Amanda nodded, taking back the photographs. She could feel the unease creeping up her spine, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She spent the next few days visiting different spots around the city, markets, rundown schools, other shelters. Every question seemed to hit a dead end. Faces turned away, conversations cut short. Each time, the tension in her chest grew, a knot tightening with every refusal to help. One evening, as she left a small convenience store, she felt it. Eyes on her. The streetlights flickered dimly as she started walking toward her apartment, her pace steady, but her senses sharp. A car rumbled slowly behind her, its headlights dull against the growing dark. She glanced over her shoulder, pretending it was nothing, but the car kept pace. Her heart pounded in her ears as she turned down an alley, hoping to lose them. But the car stopped just as she quickened her step. The silence that followed was suffocating. Amanda ducked behind a dumpster, her breath catching in her throat. She pulled out her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed. "I know you've been looking into something dangerous." The voice on the other end was low, calm, menacing. Amanda's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "You don't need to know my name," the voice said, "but you need to stop, now, or you'll never see your son again." The line went dead. Amanda stood frozen, her phone still pressed to her ear. The weight of the threat settled over her, but with it, a burning determination grew. She shoved the phone into her pocket and made her way back to the street. The car was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. The next day, Amanda found herself at the police station. The front desk officer gave her a disinterested glance, but when she asked for Detective Brian Carter, his demeanor changed. Carter was one of the few who still had a reputation for being clean. He met her in a small room, his eyes tired but sharp. "You said you had something important," he said, sitting across from her. Amanda slid the photos across the table. "My son is missing. I think he's been taken by the same people who took these children." Carter frowned as he studied the pictures. "You understand what you're getting yourself into, right? These people, they don't play around. You could get hurt." "I don't care," Amanda said, her voice steady. "I need to find my son." The detective's gaze lingered on her for a moment, as if weighing her resolve. "All right," he said finally. "I'll see what I can find, but you need to be careful. Once you're in this, There's no going back. The ticking of the clock on the wall was maddening. Each second hammered into Amanda's mind as she sat across from Detective Brian Carter in the cramped office of the precinct. The light above them flickered slightly, casting a cold, sterile glow over the room. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her worn jacket, the silence between them suffocating. Brian leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "Amanda, we've confirmed it. Ethan's disappearance is connected to a child trafficking ring operating across Detroit and beyond." Amanda's stomach tightened. She didn't flinch, but she could feel her chest constrict as though the air had been sucked out of the room. She had prepared herself for this. At least she thought she had. But hearing it out loud was something else entirely. The fear was no longer abstract. It was real. It had Ethan. "I wish I had better news," Brian continued. His eyes softened for just a moment. "But the reality is, these people, they're professionals. This isn't just about ransom or some random kidnapping. They take children, Amanda. They disappear." The words echoed in her mind. They disappear. Ethan wasn't just missing. He was lost in a world she didn't understand, and she didn't know if she could ever pull him back from it. She stared at Brian, her mouth dry. "What? What do we do now?" Her voice cracked despite her effort to hold it steady. "We'll keep looking," Brian said, his tone measured, but Amanda could hear the weight behind it. "My team is doing everything they can, but we need to be realistic. This won't be easy, and it won't be quick." Amanda bit her lip, the metallic taste of fear thick on her tongue. There was something in Brian's words that unsettled her, something that made her question whether she could really trust him, trust anyone. She had spent too long in a world where promises were broken, where corruption was the norm. Was Brian any different? Did he truly care, or was she just another case? She shifted in her seat, her hands tightening into fists on her lap. "I can't just sit here and wait," she said, her voice more solid this time. "I have to do something." "I understand that," Brian replied, his tone cautious. "But you can't go out there on your own. These people are dangerous, Amanda. They'll stop at nothing to protect their operation. I need you to trust me on this." Trust. The word rang hollow in her ears. Her experience with Michael's debts, the way the system had failed her time and again, had taught her not to trust anyone. But Ethan, her son, was out there, somewhere in the grasp of these people, and she knew she couldn't do it alone. Not this time. Her gaze met Brian's, searching for any sign of doubt in his eyes. "I don't have a choice, do I?" she asked quietly. "You do," Brian said after a pause, "but if you go off on your own, you're risking more than just your life. You might never find Ethan." Amanda looked down at the table, her fingers tracing invisible lines in the wood grain. The weight of everything pressed down on her, Lily waiting at home, oblivious to the danger surrounding her brother, the growing fear that time was running out. She had to protect her children, both of them. But how could she be in two places at once? "I'll help you," Brian said, his voice cutting through her spiraling thoughts. "But you have to trust me. We do this the right way, or we lose everything." Amanda sat still for a moment, the cold tension in the room thickening. She knew the stakes. She knew the risks. She had already felt the threat, like a noose tightening around her neck with every phone call, every shadow lurking behind her. But Ethan was her son. He needed her. "I don't care what it takes," Amanda whispered, her voice a low, fierce edge. "I'm not going to lose him." Brian nodded, his face set in a grim determination. "Then we'll get him back, together." Amanda stood, her resolve hardening. She couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt. Amanda's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as she glanced at Brian, who sat next to her, eyes scanning the empty lot ahead. The glow from a lone streetlight cast long, flickering shadows across the asphalt. The night was still, but there was something heavy in the air, something that made Amanda's stomach churn. "Are you sure about this guy?" Amanda asked, her voice quiet but tense. Brian kept his gaze forward, jaw clenched. "Ricky's not the type you trust. He's the type you use." Amanda swallowed hard, her thoughts racing. They were about to meet with a man who sold information to the highest bidder, someone who thrived in the underbelly of the city. But this was their only lead. She glanced down at her hands, trying to calm the nervous energy building inside her. Ethan's face flashed in her mind, and the fear that had become her constant companion tightened its grip. She couldn't afford to let it show. Not here. Not now. The sound of footsteps echoed through the lot, and Amanda's heart jumped. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall, thin, and moving with the kind of casual arrogance that set her on edge. He approached the car, a smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth as he saw them. Amanda hated him already. Everything about him radiated sleaze, his greasy hair, the way his eyes lingered on her too long, the half-smoked cigarette dangling from his lips. "Detective Carter," Ricky drawled, his voice a mix of amusement and contempt. "Didn't think I'd see you here. And who's this?" He nodded toward Amanda, his eyes narrowing. "Don't usually bring civilians to meetings like this, do you?" Amanda said nothing, her face set in stone. Brian didn't respond immediately either. He stepped out of the car, standing tall, arms crossed. "You know why we're here, Ricky," Brian said, voice steady. "Information. You've got it. We need it." Ricky's smirk widened. Right. Always business with you." He flicked the cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his boot. "So, what's it worth to you?" Brian took a step closer, his tone darkening. "Stop playing games. We're not here to haggle. This is about kids, about one kid in particular, Ethan." For a moment, Ricky's expression faltered, a flicker of something behind his eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the usual leer. "Ah, yeah. Ethan," Ricky said almost lazily, as though he were recalling an old memory. "Word on the street is your boy's already in the system. He's a commodity now, just like the others." Amanda felt her blood run cold, but she stayed silent, her body rigid with control. "Get to the point, Ricky," Brian growled. Ricky shrugged. "They're prepping a shipment. Few kids, including your boy. They're moving them out soon. Real soon. Mexico, I think. From there, who knows? Could be anywhere." The knot in Amanda's chest tightened, panic threatening to rise. She fought to keep her face neutral, not letting Ricky see the fear. If he saw weakness, he'd use it against her. "When?" Brian asked, his voice sharp. Ricky scratched the back of his neck, drawing out the silence as if enjoying the tension. "Could be a day, could be less. They don't exactly send out invites, you know." Amanda couldn't hold it in any longer. "Where?" she demanded, her voice firmer than she expected. "Where are they taking him?" Ricky turned to her, his smile gone now, eyes cold. "There's a warehouse down by the docks. They keep the kids there before the transport, but listen." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping. "You go in there and try to pull some hero act. You'll end up in a body bag. These people, they don't leave loose ends." Amanda stared him down, her pulse pounding in her ears. She wasn't afraid of these people. Not anymore. What scared her was the thought of losing Ethan. And now she knew where he was. The fear shifted into something sharper, something harder. Determination. Brian stepped in, his voice cutting through the tension. "We're not walking in blind, Ricky. You're going to help us. You're coming with—" Ricky's eyes widened, his cocky demeanor vanishing. "Whoa, whoa, whoa. That wasn't part of the deal, man. I gave you the info. I'm out." But Brian's expression didn't change. "You're in this now, Ricky. You help us, or I make sure every lowlife in Detroit knows you've been selling information to the cops. How long do you think you'll last, then?" The color drained from Ricky's face, and he swallowed hard. "Fine," he muttered, "but I'm telling you, this is suicide." Amanda didn't care. She turned to Brian, her voice steady. "We don't have time. We need to move." Brian nodded, the tension between them thick, but there was no hesitation. They had a plan now, a lead, and Amanda wasn't going to stop until Ethan was back in her arms. The precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, casting a cold glow over the room. Amanda sat across from Brian, her nerves fraying at the edges as she watched him sift through the documents she'd handed him. Her mind raced, replaying every detail of Ricky's warning. The clock was ticking, less than 48 hours before they smuggled the children, including Ethan, out of Detroit. Brian looked up, his eyes sharper than usual. "We've got it," he said, voice low. "They're keeping the kids in an old warehouse by the river. It's well hidden, abandoned mostly, but they've fortified it for this operation. We don't have a lot of time." The relief that washed over Amanda was brief, swallowed almost immediately by a deep, gnawing fear. The idea of Ethan locked in some warehouse surrounded by traffickers made her stomach twist. She leaned forward, her hands clutching the edge of the table. "When do we move?" Brian hesitated, glancing down at the files. "We're putting a team together now. SWAT's prepping for the raid, but this is delicate, Amanda. One wrong move, and they could disappear for good. We have to be methodical." Amanda's heart thudded in her chest. Methodical. She understood the need for precision, but every second spent planning felt like a second lost. Her jaw tightened. "I need to be there," she said, her voice steady but firm. Brian shook his head. "It's too dangerous. This isn't—" "I don't care." She cut him off, her voice gaining an edge. "You don't get it. He's my son. I'm not waiting on the sidelines while you plan this out. I'm going with you." The tension in the room thickened. Brian studied her face for a long moment, then sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Amanda, I know what this means to you, but if you're there, it complicates things. You're not trained for this. It's not just about your safety. It's about making sure we save those kids." Amanda's grip on the table tightened until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream at him, tell him she didn't care about strategy or protocol, but deep down, she knew he was right. Every part of her wanted to charge in and rip Ethan from their hands, but she had to be smart. She had to trust that Brian and his team knew what they were doing. Slowly, she released the edge of the table, her fingers trembling. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth, "but I need to know everything. Every move you make." Brian nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "I promise. You'll be in the loop. We'll get him back." Amanda exhaled, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Her hand moved to her coat pocket, where the wallet still rested, a dark reminder of how this all began. She pulled it out and placed it on the table in front of Brian. "Here, everything I found. I should have given this to you sooner." Brian's eyes flicked down to the wallet, then back to her. He took it, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of understanding in his gaze. "We'll make this right," he said quietly. The night was unnervingly quiet. Amanda crouched low behind the black van, her breath clouding the cool air. Brian and his team were already moving ahead, their black tactical gear blending into the darkness. The old warehouse loomed before them, its broken windows and crumbling walls an ominous silhouette against the night sky. She had promised to stay outside, to let the professionals handle this, but Amanda couldn't shake the gnawing fear in her chest. Every fiber of her being screamed to run inside and find Ethan herself, but she knew she had to trust Brian and his team. Still, the weight was unbearable. "Hold your position," Brian had whispered earlier, his gaze intense. "We'll get him." Now, as she watched them move toward the building, her heart pounded. They had less than 2 hours before the traffickers planned to smuggle the children out. The team moved with deliberate precision, slipping through a side door, silent as shadows. Amanda's hands trembled. She squeezed them into fists, her fingernails digging into her palms. Every second stretched endlessly, her mind running wild with images of what could be happening inside. What if they didn't find him? What if they were too late? The crackle of Brian's voice came over the earpiece. "We're inside, moving through the east corridor." Amanda closed her eyes, focusing on his voice, willing herself to remain calm. She could hear the faint echo of footsteps through the earpiece, the sound of doors being pushed open. Her breath hitched with each second of silence that followed. Suddenly, there was a muffled shout, then the sharp pop of gunfire. Amanda's eyes flew open, panic surging through her. She pressed the earpiece closer to her ear, straining to hear. "Shots fired, North Wing." Brian's voice was strained. "Stay put, Amanda. We're handling it." But Amanda couldn't stay still. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She found herself creeping toward the side of the building, her heart hammering in her chest. She needed to be closer. She needed to know what was happening. As she neared the door, she heard a faint cry from inside, high-pitched, terrified. "Ethan." She didn't think. She pushed the door open and slipped inside, her pulse racing. The interior was dimly lit, the smell of rust and dampness heavy in the air. Amanda moved quickly, her footsteps quiet on the concrete floor. She followed the faint sounds of scuffling and voices, her body tense, ready to spring. Then she saw them. Ethan, huddled with a group of other children, his face pale and streaked with tears. He looked so small, so fragile. Amanda's breath caught in her throat, relief and terror colliding in her chest. She moved toward him, her hands trembling. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. He looked up, his wide eyes locking onto hers. "Mom!" In an instant, they were together, Amanda pulling him into her arms, holding him tightly. But the relief was short-lived. A shadow moved in the corner of her vision, one of the traffickers, armed, moving toward them. "Get down!" Brian's voice roared from behind her. The next moments were a blur. Shots rang out, the man fell, and Brian's team swarmed the room. The traffickers were quickly subdued, handcuffed and dragged out. Amanda held Ethan close, her body shaking, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had found him. He was safe. But nothing would ever be the same. The darkness they had walked through lingered, its shadow still clinging to her heart. The sun was rising, casting soft light through the window of the small apartment. Amanda sat quietly at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. The familiar hum of Detroit traffic filtered through the cracked window, but for once the noise didn't feel so overwhelming. The chaos had settled. Ethan and Lily were still asleep, nestled together under the covers. She'd checked on them twice already, just to be sure. The fear of losing them still lingered in the back of her mind, but it was fading. Slowly. Brian had kept his word. The raid on the trafficking ring had been a success. The men responsible were in custody, and the children, including Ethan, were safe. But the scars remained. Ethan had stopped talking about what happened, and Amanda didn't push him. She knew healing would take time. For all of them. The sound of a knock at the door snapped her out of her thoughts. Amanda stood and crossed the room, opening the door to find Brian standing there, his face as worn and tired as hers. But there was a softness to his expression today. "I come bearing good news," he said, stepping inside. "The department secured a fund for victims of trafficking and their families. They've approved a grant for you, enough to help cover expenses while you get back on your feet." Amanda blinked, the words sinking in slowly. "You're serious?" Brian nodded, offering her a small envelope. "There's also a job opening at the local community center. They need someone who understands what these kids are going through, someone who can help them." Amanda took the envelope, feeling its weight in her hands. It wasn't just money. It was a lifeline, something solid to hold on to. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice catching. "You don't have to say anything," Brian said. "You've been through hell, Amanda, but you didn't give up. That's something." Amanda looked around the room, at the worn furniture, the peeling wallpaper. This place had been a prison, a constant reminder of her struggle, of Michael's debts, and her endless fight to survive. But now it felt different, lighter, hopeful. She sat back down, gesturing for Brian to join her. As they sat in silence, sipping coffee, Amanda let herself breathe. Really breathe. The weight that had been pressing down on her for so long had lifted, even if just a little. "I've been thinking," Amanda said after a while. "I don't want what happened to be for nothing. There are other kids out there, families like mine, who don't know how to fight back. I want to help." Brian studied her for a moment, then nodded. "We could use someone like you. There's always work to be done." Amanda felt a sense of purpose stirring inside her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She had fought against something dark and dangerous, and won. But more than that, she had found a reason to keep fighting. For her kids, for other families, for herself. "I'm ready," she said softly, more to herself than to Brian. And for the first time in a long time, she truly believed it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. But Amanda knew she wasn't walking it alone. She had her kids, her strength, and now a chance to rebuild. A chance for a new beginning.